Good afternoon to all of you. My name is Susan Derwin. I'm the director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center at UC Santa Barbara. And I want to thank you all for coming to the panel, which we've put together to share programs of the UC Humanities Network that align with the theme of this year's CHCI gathering. We're excited to have the opportunity to discuss these California projects with you today. As we know, the challenges that California faces often anticipate and focalize national and global challenges, so we hope that these projects will be of interest both for what they demonstrate about sustainable responses through the humanities and because of the approaches they take, which model how to build regional infrastructures and networks of communication. Before we begin, please allow me to say a few words about the UC Humanities Network itself. The network is composed of two entities. The first is the UC Humanities Research Institute, known as UCHRI. This is a University of California system-wide administrative organization physically located on the UC Irvine campus that fosters individual and collaborative humanities research across the UC system. A second component of the UC Humanities Network is the 10-campus collective of humanities centers, which together form the Humanities Consortium. The Consortium Humanities Centers collaborate on programming, sometimes with the Research Institute and sometimes more locally and regionally. In recent years, changes to UC funding practices have threatened to jeopardize the financial viability of the UC Humanities Network. But this threat has only deepened the engagement among the campus humanities centers and between the centers and the Humanities Research Institute. And in thinking today about how to present the work that some of our centers have done on California at Risk, we wanted to underscore the ethos of collaboration that informs our projects. We of a network have by no means mastered the art of collaboration, but we are at the very least a regional model whose stability is dependent upon the way we continue to grow organically and to evolve intentionally. Organically, because as a network, our ideas for collaboration are generated from the ground up. In our meetings and through our communications, we seek to identify overlapping areas of research and community engagement on our respective campuses so that we can forge partnerships that enable us to scale up projects to create inter-campus programs of broader impact. And we, as a network, have been able to evolve intentionally, largely because the Humanities Research Institute affords us a structure for system-wide collaborations. In this regard, Julia Lupton, the HRI director of the last 2 years, has been an exemplar of innovative program building. With her finger on the pulse of the current state and stakes of the humanities, she has fostered interdisciplinary research initiatives and alliances that take the humanities in new and relevant directions. As you will see, much of what will be presented today is about process, the skills required to create successful humanities collaborations, to implement these collaborations, and to disseminate their outcomes. So that we hope that our presentations are both informative and generative, that they may spark ideas for your own centers and institutes, in your own states, within your specific contexts, and in response to the needs and possibilities of your campuses. So our first speaker today will be Christina Lux. Christina is Managing Director of the Center for the Humanities at the University of California, Merced. She holds a PhD in Romance Languages from the University of Oregon, and she has studied and is multiply certificated in the areas of conflict resolution, negotiation, and mediation of violent conflict. She is a widely published poet and author, and her book of poetry, War Bonds, appeared this spring. Christina will be followed by Pranav Anand. Pranav is the faculty director of the Humanities Institute at UC Santa Cruz. He is professor of linguistics, specializing in semantics and pragmatics. His work leverages linguistic fieldwork, logical analysis, philosophy of language, and computational linguistics to understand context-dependence, perspective-taking, and subjectivity. Finally, Julia Lupton and Amanda Swain will engage in a conversation about an ongoing initiative. Julia, as I said, is the interim director of the UC Humanities Research Institute. She is also a distinguished professor of English at UC Irvine, where she co-directs the new Swain Shakespeare Center. And she is currently a co-investigator on a large climate action grant, Wildland-Urban Interface Climate Action Network. Amanda Swain, her interlocutor, is executive director of the UCI Humanities Center. She holds a PhD in history, and she manages major grant-funded programs such as the Mellon Foundation-funded Cross-Disciplinary Graduate Student Researcher Initiative. So now let's start with Christina.
Soon after I arrived to California in 2013 to work at UC Merced, I was invited by a group of poets led by the California State Poet Laureate to facilitate a global response to Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. During Typhoon Haiyan, winds reached almost 200 miles per hour with waves up to almost 20 feet tall, the height of more than 3 grown men. The storm battered communities throughout the Philippines. More than 7,000 people died and 6 million were displaced, many finding themselves homeless. But one community stood out in eastern Samar province, almost untouched. And this was reported in media and later researched. The people who lived there felt they had been protected by mangrove trees that shielded them and absorbed the ferocity of the typhoon. Researchers at the local university agreed that the mangrove trees had miraculously absorbed much of the impact from the storm. I'd like to suggest to you that by participating in regional networks, in addition to networks like CHCI, we can function like the mangrove did during Typhoon Haiyan. In crises, we can be poised and ready to weather the storms and absorb some of the impact. Our networks will reveal in their structures how we become stronger by interweaving our roots. In some cases, and on some days, we may be the mangrove protecting others, and sometimes we are the ones protected by the mangrove. Who we are in each crisis depends on the crisis. One of the things I love about CHCI is our ability to toggle between theory and praxis. Despite my initial hat tip to glissant and mangrove thinking, I am here today to speak on the practical elements of implementing and sustaining support for scholars at risk, in this instance referring specifically to scholars under threat in their country of origin, who are seeking placement on one of our campuses in the UC. I will focus on how regional networks can be beneficial in responding to risk, threat, crisis, and insecurity. In the face of violence and intersecting systems of oppression, we can both create and tap into multi-layered local and regional networks for support. Whether formal or informal, these networks can bolster our responsiveness, allow us to remain agile and nimble in the midst of crises, preventing isolation and burnout. These overlapping networks may also help us become critically responsive and reflective as we continue our work. This question was earlier raised. Can we critique while doing the work? Instead of reactive or focused on one-time decontextualized interventions. I'd like to share with you the regional California-wide networks we have benefited from across the UC system, as Susan was earlier describing, as a complement to CHCI as a network, and to emphasize the value of regional networks in case you would like to explore building your own, or you'd like to compare and contrast. The University of California system is composed of 10 campuses. Berkeley is the oldest, and our campus, UC Merced, is the youngest, established in 2005. So we greatly benefit from the experience and resources of the network. In regards to supporting scholars at risk, UCHRI, Julia's Institute, and UC Merced's Humanities Center have recently been most actively involved among the members of the Humanities Network, while also reporting back to our sister campuses. However, the UC system itself has had an ongoing collaboration across all campuses, sometimes through departments, sometimes through individual faculty or other centers, such as the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley, where scholars at risk are hosted or the networks through which they come vary. As Jane Newman mentioned yesterday, this has been at least 75 scholars at risk over time. Historically, support for scholars at risk has been a faculty-driven effort, with faculty members connecting about their work on respective campuses via email and occasional meetings. And some of those faculty I see in this room. In 2021, in the wake of the influx of refugees from Afghanistan, Jane Newman, who you heard recently speak, initiated a letter to the UC system-wide president signed by faculty across our campuses requesting funding for each campus to better support and host scholars at risk. We didn't immediately get the funding. This was what prompted, however, our provost at UC Merced to join as a host campus, realizing we were the last of the UCs to do so, despite requests dating back several years from our faculty. This was largely accomplished due to the continued efforts of our faculty director, who's sitting in the middle of the room, Ignacio Lopez Calvo, who finally convinced the provost to provide funding by sharing the letter to the UC president with him. The provost's funding was matched by our own center's funding, Ignacio's endowed chair, and donors in the first 2 years we hosted a scholar at risk. Following the sudden arrival of refugees from Afghanistan, with more than 100 families resettled in our Central Valley region in a short time between Tracy and Turlock, just south of here, alongside Governor Newsom's designation of California as a welcoming state, faculty began to feel the intense need for more infrastructure and a longer-term plan instead of continuing to respond individually to host scholars in an ad hoc manner. Due to lack of staff support and the fact that much of this labor was volunteer labor on the part of faculty who were often reinventing the wheel on each campus in order to host scholars, faculty realized it would be more effective to strategize about what it looks like to work together intentionally over a long period of time. As a result, UCHRI, Julia, hosted a conference, Refuge at Risk, Concepts, Infrastructures, Futures, with Jane Newman and Ignacio Lopez Calvo co-organizing in spring of 2022, through which we were able to bring together faculty who were advocating for scholars at risk across our system, alongside the scholars at risk we were hosting, to have conversations. In addition to panels on the history and future of refuge and on critical refugee studies, we were able to have closed sessions with our hosted scholars at risk, alongside scholars from the Global Academy of the Middle East Studies Association, to hear about their experience being hosted in the United States, what was most needed, and how we could provide better support. This was followed up with a survey administered by UCHRI to scholars at risk. The conference brought to light 3 core questions or issues. 1, an urgent question: what happens after the first year a scholar is hosted? A scholar arrives, they've barely arrived, and they're already trying to figure out, what happens in year 2. And there is no security for year 2. 2, how could we be more proactive as a network? How could we better share our knowledge and avoid pitfalls in hosting scholars? 3, wouldn't the scholars equally benefit from an ongoing network of peers as our faculty and centers had, instead of working in isolation on each campus? The survey further highlighted the specific needs of these scholars so that we could think about how to best support them. Following this, we have been working across all campuses over the past year to establish a better long-term model. Julia Lupton, myself, and Nancy Postera at UC San Diego, David Lloyd at UC Riverside, and Jane Newman at UC Irvine first sought the buy-in of our faculty across the campuses on creating a longer-term plan. That plan would allow for regular convenings, mentorship professionalization, and staff support for hosting scholars, in addition to hiring incentives similar to those offered under our President's Postdoctoral Fellows Program for those who wish to remain in the UC system. The UC Office of the President, while they have yet to provide funding, did convene a large group of UC stakeholders, leadership from IIE Scholar Rescue Fund and Scholars at Risk, who provided feedback on the plan in the fall of 2023. In spring 2024, this group began submitting the proposal to external funders and will continue to seek funding to better support Scholars at Risk UC-wide. These are the three lessons I think we can draw from our experience to date, working as a regional network through the UC system to better support scholars at risk. 1, avoid top-down models and allow for flexibility at the local level while still providing leadership and sharing best practices. 2, overlapping networks can enhance resilience and sustainability. 3, budgets may come and go, but the network remains. First, a top-down model is not beneficial to true agility and adaptability. However, some leadership and record keeping is helpful to galvanize people and continue to bring them back together. Campuses and a network should be free to be responsive to their on-the-ground situations and conditions while also sharing best practices. 2, overlapping networks enhance resilience and sustainability. In our case, we should not overlook the importance of creating networks for the scholars we host of their own peers, their own support system regionally, in addition to our faculty and administrative networks. It can also be beneficial to think about our membership in different groups and various networks locally, regionally, nationally, and globally, and how they overlap. The interstices of those networks may allow for something like a callus, that place where when a bone is broken, it may heal back more strongly. This may be hyperlocal volunteer and refugee support networks overlapping with the UC system-wide support for scholars at risk alongside the network of the scholars themselves and in addition to the national networks provided by IIE, Scholar Rescue Fund, and Scholars at Risk based in New York. 3, whether we have millions of dollars in funding, which we wouldn't mind, or $10,000 annually across the whole UC system, we can be agile and adaptive in finding ways to support the network itself and amplify what the network can provide and deliver. Now that said, for any deans, senior administrators, funders in the room, this does not mean that financial and staff support are not needed or needed only at the most minimal levels. For example, you can take out your iPhone now in this moment and create a film with all of the people in this room, and you will have a film. Despite the genius and creativity of the people in this room, that may be a different film than if you invest significant funding over a period of years and have the correct technical equipment to create the film. Both are possible. One is not always better. The question is how institutions choose to invest and maximize their resources, which is in part an ethical question. One of my first true lessons in organizing and building networks came from my mentor, Randall Maurice Jelks, Ruth M. Hall's professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Indiana University. At the time, about 25 years ago, I figured this out the other day, it sounds like a really long time ago. I was an undergraduate at Calvin University, where I worked as his student assistant. A junior faculty member, he was overburdened with service demands as one of the only Black faculty members at our institution. Indeed, I believe they replaced him with a few people when he left. Yet he decided to bring together Black faculty from across West Michigan for a reception so that they could network, build ties informally, and potentially more formally collaborate over time. My job as an undergraduate student worker, one of the few resources he was provided with, was to create invitations, establish the list of invitees, communicate, and organize this reception for faculty. What I learned was the power of bringing people together, that work could begin with limited resources, and also that a simple invitation may be the beginning of a network. One of my most recent lessons came from a scholar at risk we hosted, Shiraz Noorani, a journalist, who brought my family food when our house was flooded during recent storms in January of 2023. as we were spending days and nights fighting rain and digging trenches with our children after my husband and I had just recovered from COVID. And as I helplessly watched my hometown of Planada go entirely underwater a few minutes away. When I was frozen, immobile, physically limited, and exhausted, he chose to act and respond, not only to me, but my family, and with an understanding of the devastation impacting our broader community. Yesterday, I believe it was someone from Academy in Exile, but I'm not sure, I just saw the back of their head. Someone talked about theorizing, but also the moment when we must act. For us, one such moment was seeing more than 100 Afghan refugee families living in hotels for months in our communities as permanent housing was pending. While we can critique the systems and structures, and I have, that resulted in their arrival, there were nevertheless 100+ families in hotels 30 minutes down the road. In at least one hotel, they were receiving free breakfast, but we learned that when they first arrived, they had no food stamps and had limited cash or access to food. While our staff immediately responded in our own limited way, we learned that it is the Bay Area Islamic centers from Oakland and San Jose that pulled from their own networks to provide support, including weekly food distribution over a period of months. This care circulates, flows in the face of cold bureaucratic systems, the failure of social structures, the failure of refugee agencies, the lack of justice. Such care still circulates through our overlapping networks.
Thank you so much, Christina, for that. Now I'm worried about following it. So my talk is a bit more focused from the discussion of the UC network. As Susan said, I'm faculty director of the Humanities Institute at UC Santa Cruz, THI. And I'm going to talk about how THI has tackled this intersection of the humanities and AI, just as a kind of exemplary model of what we have done. And we've already sort of had a preview of maybe some of the kinds of questions in our earlier session today. But I want to give you, I guess, a narrative about how we've been approaching this. Our umbrella concept right now is California at risk, and there's some pretty existential threats from artificial intelligence. I want to begin by acknowledging them because I'm not going to talk about them. So there's social ones, political ones, economic ones, ecological ones, pedagogical ones. But I also want to say that these, especially modern systems like generative AI, large language models, some of these systems I work on for my research, things like ChatGPT, they're also a point of opportunity for humanists, both to open up rapid and widespread analysis of texts and images and videos, but also new research avenues in critical AI studies, which is really needed. And I'm going to sort of point to, at least on our campus, a readiness from some of our colleagues in us intervening in those spaces. So THI has well, some graphics that aren't displaying, but now just imagine some ionic columns there. The THI has 3 pillars: research, student success, and public engagement. And I'm going to talk about areas in each of those, but I'm going to do them in the following order. I'm first going to talk about a collaborative curricular intervention, a technology certificate that our humanities division started. And then I'm going to turn to research, and I'll talk about a cluster on AI that THI just started running this year, as well as a public fellowship with people in the AI industry we did 2 years ago. And then I'm going to conclude and talk about how we can leverage our existing programming to orient towards issues related to technology. I might say this later. If I don't, I want to say it now so that at least you'll remember if I won't, which is that I would like us to focus, as someone who works on AI, I'd like us to focus as humanists not on AI, which is a modern buzzword, but on technology, which fits in natural issues and science and technology studies that humanists have been studying for a very long time, and gives us an immediate seat at the table, and helps to historicize our moment and recognize that the challenges that we're facing are systemic and are extremely old. It's something that our colleagues in engineering don't seem to be aware of. I might come back to this if I remember. So first, I want to talk about pedagogy. I'll focus on this certificate program called Humanizing Technology. There's a cool logo that is also not displaying. This is developed with support from an NEH award to our dean, Jasmine Linder. I just have to wait. Okay. So THI manages the grant, and I'm a co-PI on it. But I also want to acknowledge that we were really instrumental in building it. Not only me, but Irene. We were there at all of the original conversations. The goal of the certificate is to develop coursework in the humanities that connects with the interests and careers of engineering students, and to show them that they can use humanistic methods to develop their capacities as deliberative critical thinkers about social and cultural systems, and say technology is one of those. And that's both for their careers and for their futures as members of society. So it took us about 5 years to get here. Finally, this past year, we finished the first year of the certificate itself. 300 students have taken courses in the certificate, and only 10 have completed the certificate. You can ask me why in the question period. But one surprising finding I want to mention is that we created this with the certificate with engineering students in mind, but we opened it to everyone. And only like 1% were people in the humanities, which actually is a good thing because they already have existing classes that do, frankly, a better job of that kind of training. But 40% were from engineering, and 40% of the students came from social sciences, particularly in areas like psychology. That's something I'm going to come back to a little bit later. The key to the birth of the program, though, was collaboration, not collaboration of a network, across the universities of California, but at least within our California university. So the program and the individual courses were built collaboratively with a mix of interested faculty and graduate students who applied to a call that THI ran. And I have to credit our dean. She was a key to making this happen. I said it took 5 years. For 3 years, nothing was happening. I have the email chain to prove it. And then when she arrived, she used her powers of decanal persuasion to get us in a room together and to not let us leave until we drafted something. And she was also able to bring in the engineering dean, whose staff arranged a panel of faculty stakeholders across engineering division. And what they said, it was I was a little skeptical, but it was extremely important. Because what they said was they wanted their students to learn important ideas that they didn't know themselves. So things about, and these are their direct terms, intersectionality, critical ethnic studies, ethical practice, history of technology. I mean, I have all of these notes from these scholars where they said, we want our students to know these things, but we don't know them ourselves. Not only do we not have time, we don't have the expertise, so we're thrilled by the prospect of you doing this for us. And I think that's a lesson that is not particular to our campus. That's universal. You just need to find a way to get to the dean of engineering, to get to the interested faculty, and those have become collaborators for us in developing the certificate here on. In addition, the associate dean for undergraduate education in engineering recorded these amazing videos. Maybe I'll link to some of them in the Padlet, breaking down how each of our courses contents would help students in their careers. And it was just really remarkable, as he said, you'll learn this. This is how that's going to work for you in the workforce. And I mean, he really understands how to translate between our disciplines and what the students there are interested in. Okay, so once we had that brief from the people in engineering, our team of about 20 now felt empowered that training students in humanistic approaches to technology studies was worthwhile for them. And since we've started this, the existence of the certificate has accrued to us a number of advantages that come from having something new, named, and aggressively advertised. So it's given the Humanities Division a kind of psychic footprint on campus with AI, which we didn't have before. But now we have this cool logo and buttons, and so people know about it. And that's not at all to be laughed at, actually. I mean, we're laughing, but it's actually remarkably significant. I was surprised. So lots of people from across campus have reached out to us to start thinking about new pedagogical connections building off of that. Just to give you some examples, I've been working with some people in engineering about doing this now at the graduate level for their graduate students. That's a much longer conversation, but they said, we want to do humanizing tech for graduate students. I was like, okay, great, let's start thinking about that. It's also created a kind of infrastructural peg that we can hang other coursework on outside of existing departmental structures. And that's really, I think, important for something cross-cutting like AI. It's not something that's going to be housed in any particular department. So, for instance, you see on that second bullet point, one of our faculty in literature, Zach Zimmer, created a class called AI in Human Imagination, and that is a literature class, but since he'd been involved in the design of the certificate, he made sure that this new class fit into our learning outcomes for the certificate, and so we were able to add it in directly. So it's not just this sort of orphaned class in literature, it's something that people can take and fits into the existing structure. So in addition, the 20 of us who met for a year to design this, we now have a group that we can talk to about our research, which often intersects with issues around technology or artificial intelligence. And that's wonderful to have colleagues outside of our department that we can turn to talk about issues that are particular to this domain. That desire led us in THI to launch a research cluster on AI in the humanities this year. We did that through our normal cluster call. It sort of arose. Most of the affiliated faculty were from the certificate, but the others were attracted because they said, hey, you did that. We'd like to do something like that for research. And the work of the cluster has been pretty unglamorous. It's just people coming and doing short research talks about what they're working on. But what it has meant is that we have a congregational space for people not just within our division, but across campus to come talk and to form a network. And that's been very exciting. So we've had people from the arts, social sciences, engineering, and the humanities, and that's included both faculty and graduate students. So graduate students get a chance to workshop chapters from their dissertations to a range of experts. We've had people from privacy and trust experts from industry have shown up, faculty from global and community health. I had no idea they were interested in this. Now we're trying to design something with them. Visiting faculty from engineering. And the side conversations and nascent partnerships that have started in that room are very exciting. Personally, like I am now advising like an engineering grad student who showed up on a project, and one faculty member in global health is working with some grad students on designing a class on AI in health. So there's a lot that has come out of that just because of being in the same room, as we've talked about. Now, beyond that, it's helped folks in the division who are working on AI to find some common cause. Like one of my favorite anecdotes is like in an early meeting, two faculty in history remarked that they had no idea that the other person was working on AI, right? And they're in the same department because it never comes up in a natural conversation. So I just want to quickly mention like one other way that we've connected humanists with AI, and this is something from last year, not this year, and it's outside of the like hum tech narrative that I mentioned, but it's related, and it emphasizes connecting with humanists, and that's we leveraged our public fellowship program at THI with the Reality Labs. I don't know how to say this. Reality Labs, which is a division of the Meta Corporation, also known as Facebook. But crucially, it was with the person in the orange box there, Sarah Papazaglakis, who is a literature PhD from the university and also a previous public fellow, and she is interested in issues around trust. And privacy in the metaverse. And so we did a call, and a student worked with her to design a toolkit for industry practitioners drawing on speculative fiction. Maybe I'll put a link to that in the Padlet so you can look at it. But it's a way in which traditional methods that humanists have can have real purchase with people in industry as well. Okay, so I want to close very quickly by talking about how we can, beyond these things, use our roles as crucial vehicles for public discussion and sense-making to bring the public into the conversation about AI. So there are exceptions, but I've been really shocked on my campus how disinterested my faculty colleagues in engineering, people I collaborate with, are about talking with the public about the societal impacts of new technologies. It's just not something they really are very invested in. And it's a void that we here need to jump into, because it's part of our role in terms of public engagement. So this year, building on that Humanizing Tech certificate, our annual theme was technology. And we've tried to use that to highlight a range of work by humanities colleagues. So we have a faculty series. We've used that to talk about things in technology. And a grad profiles, our annual books that we read together. The Deep Read was a book about technology, Anand Diaz's Trust. But it wasn't about AI, note, but it was, right? And we also coordinated our lecture series this year. So we featured Mariana Iskander, who's the CEO of Wikimedia, the nonprofit behind Wikipedia. And previously, for another sort of related thing, we hosted Jaron Lanier. And these are just existing talks that we have. But it's a way of showing the public that our center can be a place for deep, insightful conversations about the future with AI. So finally, I just wanted to leave you with some lessons. I've already sort of sprinkled them throughout. Oh, and I'm hitting the wrong button. So, this is the one I just said a moment ago, which is that we should embrace our role in public sense-making to think about building connections with society. The second one I think is the really important one to take away, which is, to start collaborating, just look locally to the humanists that you work with. A lot of them are probably already doing this, but silently, and you'll find a way to build a network from there. In addition, looking outside of the humanities is a much longer vision, and so it's not going to be something that is going to be possible without a long sort of dialogue process. And that's in part because disciplines have different kinds of conventions. So as part of that, those conversations are going to have to lead to a need for compromise in some sense. And so if you're looking for a connection between engineers and humanists, you might find that with people that sort of occupy a liminal space between them. And so I think of people in social science like those psychologists that showed up in our classes as playing that role. So I would say make sure to involve not just the humanists around you and look to the engineers, but also your colleagues and arguably your closer colleagues in social science, because they can speak your language and they can speak their language. And that's something that we're going to try to turn to moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Susan, for your great introduction. And thank you, Christina, for talking about the work we've been doing for the last couple of years on scholars at risk. And thank you, Pranav, for that great roadmap to the AI conversation. CHCI hosted a conference just last week, which we did invite you to, but you chose CHCI, which was the right choice. But we did have 4 campuses represented and had a great conversations. And also the CHCI new theme is on technology. So I think there's a lot of growth there. But we're going to talk about environmental humanities for a little bit as the final part of this discussion. So, hi, Amanda.
Hi, Julia.
So, Amanda and I started working together in 2014 when I was director of UCI's Humanities Center, and you were and still are executive director. And we got involved in environmental projects together around 2015. I had met a scientist, and here's the importance of those local connections. I had met a scientist named Steve Allison at a teaching academy, which turned out to be a great place to meet people outside of the humanities who are open to new kinds of collaborations. And Steve shared a grant call for graduate student researchers in climate and ecology with us and said, hey, your grads can apply. And so we ended up having 2 grad students in English who ended up participating. This is Danilo Caputo with his poster presentation around 2016. And their work built a bridge between our Humanities Center and STEM scientists, while also greatly expanding the horizons of the 2 grad students who now have tenure-track jobs. And we ended up hosting a climate summit, a local climate summit with Steve Allison, And we also ran a science communications class with him for several years. So it was very exciting, and sort of looking back at it, what I realized we were doing, and it's interesting that trust was a key term for you as well, because that's like one of the principles I've found over the years is trust, and also building relationships, and also figuring out where those shared vocabularies are. And those three things, we really started building, and they take a lot of patience and a lot of care. Care was a key word in Christina's comments as well. I'm not a naturally patient person, as those who work with me know, but it is what's required for this kind of work to happen.
And that one relationship with Steve Allison has continued to step-by-step lead to a broad range of collaborations and partnerships with non-humanists that have primarily provided opportunities for graduate students at UCI to engage in cross-disciplinary training opportunities. So the next thing that happened was that Steve Allison had received a National Science Foundation graduate training grant, and he opened it up for humanities graduate students to apply to participate. And Juan Manuel Rubio, who you see here, was a history PhD student at the time. He received 3 years of National Science Foundation funding on this training grant, and worked on a project documenting lead poisoning in the city of Santa Ana in Southern California. And Juan produced a podcast as part of the project, reconstructing local, state, and federal decision-making that resulted in this significant lead contamination in this community that is 77% Hispanic Latinx. And that was in conjunction with science grad students who were doing things like actual, testing soil and those kinds of things. And I will put a link in the Padlet to his website and podcast, because they are really amazing. But then came the time for us as the Humanities Center to think about taking the lead on a project, and for us to be the ones to collaborate, to initiate the collaboration from the humanities side with our colleagues in STEM and medicine at UCI. So inspired by Juan Manuel Rubio's experience working with Steve Allison, the UCI's humanities dean and I developed a proposal to the Mellon Foundation for what we called Embedded Cross-Disciplinary Graduate Student Researchers, which was funded in 2021. And we wanted to place humanities PhD students whose research interests engaged in cross-disciplinary topics and methodologies with non-humanist faculty, especially those working in environmental sciences and medical research. And our goal was to increase the cross-disciplinary fluency, those vocabularies, of future humanities scholars, our graduate students, as well as of non-humanities colleagues on our campus looking towards, again, future potential collaborations. And we believe that the embedded cross-disciplinary graduate student researcher positions could create supportive environments to engage in this kind of relationship building and shared vocabulary building without the pressure of having to produce a high-value research project, expecting some scientists and humanists to come together and apply for a huge grant. So I'll give you 2 examples of our embedded cross-disciplinary GSRs, and maybe you'll get to see Megan's face. There she is. So we have placed 18 humanities graduate students in these positions, and we still have funding to place a couple more. So Megan Cole, PhD candidate in English literature, was placed with UCI's Solutions That Scale, which is a cross-disciplinary initiative primarily housed in physical sciences to discover and implement scalable, sustainable solutions to the problem of climate change. And one of the first things that they asked her to do was a literature review on, to find articles documenting collaborative climate change research projects that included humanists. What she did find was an article in the journal Sustainability Science from 10 years previous calling on scientists to collaborate with humanists, yet no articles appeared in the following 10 years documenting such research in that journal. And there were very few articles documenting any kind of research partnerships in that 10-year period. And as a result of her work with solutions that scale, Megan has published in that very journal, Sustainability Science, an article that makes the case for climate humanities research as crucial to climate change solutions. Dalton Salvo, who also happened to be a PhD candidate in English, they were not all English graduate students, I will say, brought his research on how virtual, augmented, and mixed reality technologies function rhetorically to virtual reality modules that provide operating room experience. And this is for bioengineering undergraduates and medical students. He co-designed and co-produced 5 modules that demonstrate heart surgery and the use of new biomedical instruments. And Dr. King, the biomedical engineering professor and supervisor, said that these were the best modules she had ever utilized because Dalton was able to apply concepts of rhetoric, narrative, and virtual reality pedagogy as they designed these modules, so that rather than simply showing a demonstration of tools during a surgery, they had these pedagogical elements built in and created sort of rhetorical narrative structures to the what the demonstrations were. And and Dalton himself said when he signed up for this, he had no idea how he could possibly contribute to the research work of a biomedical engineer, and then he saw that he actually had something to contribute that would make a difference in healthcare going forward. So our takeaways from this project, in which we took the lead as the partner with non-humanist researchers. One is that it is very human intensive. The project required a lot of staff time to recruit the STEM and medical faculty and to recruit humanities graduate students. We were matchmakers to create the best opportunities for each side. When we were working on the proposal in collaboration with Mellon, they kept saying, but how are you actually going to put together the faculty and graduate students? And we kept saying, well, we're not sure because we can't find anybody who's done this before, but we're going to kind of just do matchmaking. And then they say again, can you give us more details? And we'd say, well, we're not sure. So we just kept going. And, but we also had to provide a lot of mentorship to the graduate students and the faculty advisors because each of them were operating outside their comfort zone. It was up to us to demonstrate that the humanities could bring value. We made the claims that humanists frame research questions differently, bring different methodological approaches, and have different knowledge sets that contribute to the work of environmental scientists and medical researchers, for example. But we also had to give them examples of what that would look like because they didn't necessarily come up with those examples themselves. So drawing on our experience working with Steve Allison and other scientists and drawing on examples from our other UC campuses and our colleagues and asking them for examples was really helpful to be able to walk into a meeting called by the Dean of Engineering and say, here's some ways that humanities can contribute to your work. And finally, the process itself is the success. So our goal, of course, is that every embedded cross-disciplinary graduate student has a tangible outcome from their year-long research appointment, but we also know that this project is a lot about planting seeds. Our graduate students are gaining confidence by contributing from their own disciplinary training to unfamiliar collaborative and disciplinary research spaces. They're gaining vocabularies and methodological cross-disciplinary training that they can carry into their careers. And the Humanities Center has a wider network of faculty across the campus and numerous departments, and we can continue to build relationships with them through programming, graduate training opportunities, and research partnerships.
Such a great cross-training model. And the next step then is to see if the scientists will build humanists into their grants. And that's what we were able to do with a new grant at UCHRI. The University of California issued a call for climate action proposals. Climate action moves beyond climate science to partner with communities on implementing change, and that's where humanities and social sciences can play a role. We were interested in getting involved but didn't quite know how. First, we held some open meetings from faculty from across the UCs. I invited that guy, Steve Allison, to attend. He was very interested, and he ended up inviting us to join his grant, which was great. So what are we doing in the grant? We are supporting the communications needs of what is now called the Wildland Urban Interface Climate Action Network, which is pronounced We Can. I didn't come up with that, but it works. What does that mean to support the communications needs? So we helped build a visual identity and a website, and we are developing content, kind of like climate journalism, with and for the many grant partners. And we're advising partners, both campus partners and community partners, on how they can design and implement their own communications goals. In addition, we're also running a summer institute in climate communications, and which will be attended by 8 graduate students from 6 UC campuses. And we're very excited. The students are amazing. We had a lot of applications, so we got some really terrific students from across the UC. And so one of our activities will be having the students educate each other through a series of skill shares. One of them is an expert in smellscapes as a kind of experiential and experimental form of inquiry and learning. Another one writes critical cookbooks. Another is very active in K-12 engagement and curricular design. We have an ecologist working on the life of bees, and we have an English PhD student working on early modern oceans. We'll also bring in speakers, mainly UC speakers, with expertise in areas such as feminist research methods, environmental justice, and speculative fiction. So I was interested in that aspect of your project. And of course, they'll be socializing in the evenings, including some Shakespeare. We've also used the grant to convene an interfaith working group that engages local faith leaders and their communities in climate conversations. And this is, I think it's coming, yes. We held our interfaith group held its first event on May 9th. Thanks for coming, Amanda. And the focus was on water, and we began with what we called a water communion, in which people brought water from different parts of the county and poured it into a shared basin. We had 70 people attend and participate. Very few of them were from the university in this water communion that was then followed by a scientist and a community activist talking about water and climate change locally. And we're going to follow this with events next year on fire, air, and earth, and we hope to develop an interfaith climate curriculum around the 4 elements that can be adapted by different community groups interested in these matters. We were able to hire a postdoc and several graduate student researchers to help us get this work done, because it is indeed human intensive, a lot of matchmaking. And it's, of course, a great experience for those graduate students and postdocs to participate. Takeaways from me is, first of all, the importance and art of collaborative grant writing. To write this large, the whole grant is $5.5 million. We have about 600,000 of that. The whole grant we met, this is kind of like the process you described, once a week, 10 to 20 of us from very different disciplines and communities writing the grant together. Like, we don't know how to do that in the humanities. So it was a great team science kind of boot camp for me, and a very different way about thinking about collaborative research. Communications. I mean, that's what our beat in this big grant is to provide communications. And it's an interesting area. I also run an internship program for the English department in communications for our English majors. And I think it's a very ripe area for the humanities to partner with other units. There's also a kind of gap between communications, which is somewhat instrumental, and humanities research. And I think that Pranav's phrase about public sense-making kind of helps maybe bridge that gap between communications as an instrumental activity and humanities research. So I'm going to copy that.
Sure.
It was great. And then finally, I'm really excited personally by the work we're doing with about 8 different faith groups in Orange County. And I think that climate and religion is a very productive area for community-based work, because congregations, I like your expression congregational space as well. I think congregations are places where the humanities are alive. There's text study, there's performance, ritual, embodied learning, kinesthetic learning, to come back to Debarty's wonderful talk. And there's also areas of social concern and social justice that can be activated in those spaces. So in my last year as interim director of the UCHCI, I hope to work on a grant that would combine religion and climate and build on some of this interfaith work that we've been doing. So that's it for us. I hope we haven't gone too far over, but yeah.
Thank you all. All right, we have time for questions for our panelists, so if you have one, please raise your hand, and here comes the mic. Thank you. Any questions?
The second A afternoon always feels like the longest.
After lunch.
Well, thank you for this fascinating panel and the great examples of collaboration between the humanities, engineering, science, tech that you gave. I was really drawn to your insistence that there is a strong tradition of science and technology studies that can really help in informing those. At the same time, also recognizing that collaborating across epistemological divides really does take some work. And again, I loved how you presented the concrete examples of that. I just wanted to comment rather than ask questions, which is maybe not exactly the spirit, but maybe then some others will ask more questions. So I really find very convincing what you said, that curricular collaborations can actually ultimately generate research collaborations. And I would just support this from my perspective at Northeastern. At Northeastern, which as you probably know, or some of you may know, has campuses in different parts of Canada and the United States and in London as well, partially because of work that the college that I led at the time did in the experiential liberal arts, partially because of a book that our president published. We have sometimes used the term humanics in order to, in fact, describe efforts that are pretty similar to what you are saying. And in that context, I, as a former dean, found two tools incredibly important. One is a real desire on the part of the university to have cross-disciplinary appointments. And so, for example, we have an appointment between our English department and the Department of Marine Science around climate change. And we have seen in the time that I've been at Northeastern, which has been since 2011, much greater openness on the part of engineering and on especially also science and computer science to engage in just such joint appointments. Now, you know, again, from the perspective of a former dean, one has to really be okay then with some things being taught that don't directly lead to student credit hours within one's framework. But again, we all are university citizens, and for the greater good, which you are describing, I think this is very much worthwhile. And joint appointments make that a little bit easier because then there's at least joint paying for the resources as well. And then I want to advertise to this group another concept that we have pushed a lot and that I have seen as quite important for the humanities as well. And that is the concept of the combined major rather than the double major. And what we mean by combined majors is the core of two majors. For each of those combinations, in fact, you choose somewhat different classes as the core, and then you have integrative classes as well. I will be honest, in a self-critique, those integrative classes aren't always as strong as they might be. And we have been this year running a course development program in order to push more of such integrative classes that are truly collaboratively designed. Again, it resonated with a lot of the examples that you were giving as well. That has actually been also important for the humanities. Again, as I said before, we are a university that, maybe I didn't say this, but you probably know this, we're a university that is more technology, business, science oriented. And we also, I think, continue to live in a world where the humanities, in spite of these great efforts like the ones you are describing around, you know, public meaning making, where there's a lot of defensiveness on the part of students and their parents. And so the combined majors, I think, allow, again, students who have an interest in the humanities to find a combination that they can sell to their parents as well. And the outcomes with employment are very good as well. Anyway, thank you for giving me this pulpit, but I just think these kinds of examples resonate well with the really exciting initiatives that you are talking about from the UC system here.
Great, really interesting. How far have you crossed divisionally, like in terms of joint appointments? Have you
know, the social sciences more than the humanities, but we have, and some will not surprise you. So law has been a very, very common foundation. That has then also been very good in terms of technology studies because philosophy also has combined with computer science a lot. We've really built a very strong group there. I said this to some of you before. I really think what you were saying as well is I consider, of course, ethics really important, but we can't have only the applied ethicists out of philosophy at the table in these conversations about ethics for the future, right? So one of the things that I think is incredibly important for humanities broadly, but also for humanities centers, is how to align with ethnic studies and how to be at the forefront of the future of ethnic studies. And again, in terms of world making, right, we've seen so much interesting work come out of the creative portions as well as the analytical portions of ethnic studies as well. But yeah, so again, marine science, English is one of the ways in which we have pushed. Engineering has now combined, again, with philosophy, which is not so surprising. History, however, has, for example, a combined major with mechanical engineering. Not super high majors, but again, important in terms of the collaborations.
Thank you.
Thanks.
There was another.
Just real quickly, I'll say that medical schools usually have a PhD, MD option. We have had, for the first time ever, a combined MD, PhD, in which the graduate student is getting her PhD in English along with her MD. And so that was a really wonderful and fascinating combination. I don't know how you would recruit for that, but it was fantastic.
Thanks, you all. That was a really inspiring panel, and the work that you're doing is impressive. And I especially am a fan of the cross training that you were talking about. It's great. I just wondering if you could comment further on 3 issues. One is, what happened to the residential research groups at Irvine? I mean, that was it was kind of that's how Stephen and I met. So we both want to know. Because it's, it's a model, sort of an exemplary model of deep and sustained collaboration that goes on over a significant period of time, which I think is as important as the network side of it. And then the second issue has to do with workload issues of networks. It feels to me like a recipe for workaholism if it's not sustained financially and if you don't have enough people. And then the third is, the collaborations with STEM. Have you had issues around not being able to bring resources to the table on the scale of their resources?
I guess I should answer the residential research question, which is we really people stopped applying. And, the pandemic has really changed people's appetite for living in Irvine, California for a quarter. So we've really been switching in response to faculty interest to faculty working groups where we can fund many more of them, and they include money for in-person meetings and remote meetings, and can incubate some incredible ideas and partnerships, and at a lower risk level. If they don't work out, if people hate each other, we haven't invested, almost $200,000 in them. We've invested quite a bit less. So that's been a kind of evolution in response to really faculty interest and demand. Collaboration with STEM, we haven't had that problem because we were part of a grant that was funding us. So we did have some cost sharing, but it wasn't even cost sharing. It was so little they weren't even interested in counting it. And does someone want to discuss the workload? Maybe Susan or?
I can speak to that. So we were fortunate with the Mellon grant that we were able to write in a position. And at that particular point, we had to commit to continue the position, which I was very happy about because she has continued as our Graduate Futures Program Director running our graduate programs. But yes, if we hadn't had someone, we could not have taken that on with our existing staff. But the resources, especially if you're thinking about graduate training, is a very important question to ask, because many graduate students in STEM are funded off of faculty grants. They're working in faculty labs. And so they're not just going to take on some humanities graduate student for a year. The reason Juan was able to work with Steve Allison was because Steve Allison funded him through an NSF grant that he had. We were able to place students with STEM and medicine faculty because we said, we have the money to pay for these students. Now that we don't have money, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to get students placed in the same way. And then also, we just signed, there's been a new contract with UC graduate students that have also made that more expensive. So we're trying to figure that out as well. But right now, financially, we can't afford to continue this. And we're trying to figure out how to do that because we have to come with the money for our grad students.
I understood Chris's question to be more about network in general. To be maybe Susan and Christina could comment on that.
There's no answer to that. We have no solution. The workload is unreasonable. But I will say that if the network can't solve that problem, one of the things that it enables is for particularly the associate directors on whom, you know, the hard work of logistical planning and programming falls, to discuss together the problem and how they address that problem. And the other thing that the network has done under duress in a certain way, because it had to do with the changes in MRPI funding, but also now voluntarily, is that we are able to leverage different strengths on the individual campuses, and they're there for different reasons, to combine some trainings, for example. So one thing we've never discussed, at least not while I've been at these meetings, and I'm going to put this in as a footnote, is what the difference is when a humanities center is housed in a division and is considered an academic unit versus what happens when humanities centers are housed in research or considered research units. And I think the way that influences the kinds of programs that are created and that can be created. So for example, at UC Santa Barbara, we happen to be considered an academic unit, which means that we are able to teach courses. And for the network, that's meant we are able to offer courses to graduate students. We have a program in publicly training PhD students to be publicly engaged humanists. We're also able to offer seminars and workshops network-wide, sort of because that's what we do, but we can disseminate that and circulate that virtually. So that's just one example. But no, the workload issue, I guess it's just the shift in emphasis of the too heavy a workload. But yeah. Julie, does that? Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, maybe Christina wants to say something too, because we were, we spent
as
a
an
lot of
associate
time.
director.
Yeah.
Just briefly, institutions can run you dry, right, when you're trying to do this kind of work. So, however, foundations, donors, when they come to you, there's often a point of leverage, and most donors and foundations, grant-making agencies realize this, and they will try to get your institution to commit to something that will make this project more sustainable and not a drop in the bucket. So I think sometimes we don't always recognize that moment of leverage. So the more we capitalize, no, that's not the best word, but capitalize on that moment of leverage and use it. Mellon Foundation, for example, tells us to keep going back to our senior administration. They want the commitment for what's going to happen when this ends. Are we getting a commitment of staffing because we're understaffed? And it sounds like you had a similar request. Luce Foundation, that's a core part of your proposal is what is this, what's your model for sustainability? So before you get the money, before you get the prestige associated with the name of this grant, they're asking you to have these conversations with your deans, with your provosts, to get the resources that are needed to sustain the networks.
There's a hand.
Hi, thank you for that. I wanted to just say something about a sort of an unusual collaborative position that we have at the Humanities Institute at Duke University. Our institute is one of 6 signature institutes, which is, just to go to this point, it's funded at the provostial level, so it's not within the College of Arts and Sciences, even though I also report to the Dean of the Humanities as well as the Provost's office. But we have, so the institutes can have regular rank faculty, but they cannot have tenure track faculty. That you're always tenured in a department. But we have a very unusual position of someone who was hired with a PhD in literature, who works on Milton, in fact, and the Georgics and the ethic of the Georgic, who was hired actually to direct the campus farm And she now has, so she has a half staff position and a half faculty position, and brings the what is interesting about this is that she has transformed the status of the farm at Duke, such that it is now a place where there is a deep study of literature, an understanding of what it means to labor and the land, an understanding of what tobacco does to soil, for example, that is brought into an understanding of the farm and the function of a farm and the land as it has been worked on historically in North Carolina. She brings that to her classes. And she brings a literary understanding of the land, if you like, to the work of the farm as it's now been developed. So I just wanted to sort of put that out there as another model. It's not without its challenges. You know, each time there's a review, we have to think about what it means actually to create criteria for promotion, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to
just have to step in here because I'm being signaled that we do have to close.
Oh, okay.
So I'm sorry to only hear
it's
one
okay.
part of your question, but
it's all right.
I think we should all go back and ask our deans for a farm so that we can do this. So thank you all. Thank you, panelists.